So we're going to be talking about the concepts of step up and leaning in, which was the phrase that was coined by Sheryl Sandberg. I don't know if any of you read her book, Lean In, Step Up and Lean In. So she's the Chief Operating Officer of Facebook, but she's also known as one of the most influential women in the technological industry. And so great book, great read. And there's also some other stuff that's happened in her life, which I won't go into at the moment, but she's actually published a second book as well. So highly recommend it in terms of the reading for that. I'm also going to make some reference to Professor Deborah Tannen, who's the lady at the top, who is a professor in linguistics. And that is the study of language and actually how we use that. We're also going to be talking about Tim Ferriss's work, who talks about the concept of fear setting. I don't know if any of you have been involved in any of your personal development and you've been taught the concept of goal setting. Okay, well, we're going to talk a little bit about fear setting, because it's sometimes about underpinning, actually, what gets in our way, which we'll come on to. And then I'm going to finally close with the experience of somebody who was an executive assistant, and I'm going to tell you where she is now. Does that sound about okay for the next 40 minutes? Okay. Okay, so what are we here to talk about? So we're here to talk about the concept of leaning in. What do we mean by leaning in? Well, what Sheryl Sandberg talked about is that she noticed that in the environment that she was in, so she talks a lot about feminism, and I'm not here to talk about feminism, but she talked a lot about what she noticed about women in the workplace, or people that were in a supporting role in the workplace. And she noticed that quite often people would take a back seat. So they may be brought to meetings or they may be brought to presentations, and she was struck by how many women or males in supporting assistant roles actually didn't sit at the table. So if there was a conference going on or a discussion going on, even if they had a value or something to contribute, they sat at the side. And so she started to look at what was going on, and she also looked at women in general in the workplace. And so she coined the phrase, step up and lean in. So that's what we're actually going to be focused on today. But while she talks a lot about feminism and women in the workplace, and of course it's 100 years since the vote for women, so go the suffragettes, what I'm going to talk about is two different things. Well, I'm going to focus on one of those two aspects that get in the way. There are external things that get in our way that prevent us from stepping up to the table, that prevent us from having personal impact, that prevent us from stepping up. There is our external environment, the culture in which we're operating in. There may be barriers, there may be social barriers, socialism, ageism, racism, sexism. Yeah? All of those things that are going on that sometimes can limit us. Do you recognise that? Have you experienced some of that? I'm not going to focus on those. What I'm going to focus on is actually our internal self that actually gets in our way of helping us to step up and lean in. Yeah? So there are all of those things that are going on in your system, but there are also the things about your own, what we call our self-limiting beliefs and our fears that fuel our inability to step up and lean in. That make sense? Yeah? Okay. So, what are your fears? Okay, what I want you to do in twos or threes with the people that are next to you is, if you are about to do something, whether you've got a big meeting coming up, a small meeting coming up, what are the things that you fear? What do you fear about making yourself present in a meeting or in an environment where you would have liked to have spoken up? Can you ever recall going to a meeting or a presentation or a conference and somebody invites questions and you've had a question, but you've not asked it? You've wanted to ask it, but you've not asked it. What's stopped you? What's the fear? What's happening to you? So when we think about our fears, it's often our internal fears that actually prevent us from speaking up. And also, it may be that actually, small groups, we might find small groups more intimidating, or as you said earlier, walking into a room full of managing directors. You might find groups of the opposite sex, a different culture, a different race more intimidating. There are a whole range of things, and they are different for all of you. Not having enough knowledge, looking a bit silly. Do I have all of the facts? What's the culture like? I'm a bit concerned about the culture. What are the beliefs? And sometimes there are what we call these transactions. If you're working in an organisation that's very transactional and hierarchical, how dare I say, because it's positional, yeah? But that's the system, and there's something about how do you lean in and how do you generate that confidence. But in order to generate that confidence, one of the things we've got to think about is what is fueling our underlying fears. So let's just go back to that scenario, and I loved your example. How many of you have had the pleasure of watching Ally McBeal? Okay, if you haven't, I suggest you Google this. So can you think about a time when maybe you have been present in a meeting and you have spoke up, or you visualise that you're going to be speaking up, and you're around the table or you're at the table, and all of a sudden, and I love this because I think you started to do that, where you're going to make your point, and then all of a sudden it's like, can I just say something? Or you start to say something, and the minute that you open your mouth, it's like, what was it you wanted to say, Janine? Well, I was just about to say that I'm not quite sure that the forecast of last week was the right thing to do. And then all of a sudden everyone's looking at you, yeah? And you start shrinking in, your body closes in. What are you thinking when that happens? What are you thinking even in that moment when you're starting to talk? So you've made yourself, you've broken that connection, you've leaned in, but all of a sudden you're doing this. What's going on for you? What am I doing? Am I good enough, or who do you think you are to speak up? So one of the things I want us to think about, has my microphone gone off? Are we okay? You still hear me? Yeah? One of the things I want you to think about is, what are you assuming? And there are two things here. What are you assuming about everybody else around the table? And what are you assuming about yourself? But it's really interesting. It's not the point about me. What's really interesting is the point about the minute that somebody's in front of you, the minute that you're in front of a room like this, or the minute you're in front of a room like this, or a room like this. When you meet somebody, you start to make connections, and they're not always true. Yeah? I've just shown you that. Some of you were right, some of you weren't. So why do we make those assumptions? Well, the beauty is that we have the gift of hundreds of thousands of neurons in our brain. And our neurons are like filing cabinets. They're like books of knowledge, and it's bigger than the British Library. It's bigger than the library that's in the Vatican City. And our neurons store information. And what happens is, because our brain always wants to make sense of things, is that whenever we meet somebody or we encounter somebody, it tries to make sense of it. And have you ever had that where you've met somebody and there's a familiarity and you've tried to place them and you think about, oh, what are you like? Oh, or you remind me of so-and-so. And if you don't have all the information, what our brain does is it fills in the gaps. And what happens is, when we fill in the gaps, rather than leaving our mind open to inquiry about our own potential or what we might be believing about others and where we are against others, what happens is we close our opportunities. So when we make assumptions, what it does is it makes an ass of you and me. We're wrong. We're more often not wrong. So with that, what I also want us to think about is the assumptions that we make and what underlies some of those assumptions, and connect that back to our fears. And so I'm going to introduce you to the work of Tim Ferriss, who I spoke about earlier. And one of the things that how Tim got to fear setting was he actually wanted to look at what was limiting him in life. And actually, if you go onto TED, many of you watch the TED Talks? He does some great TED Talks. And how he discovered fear setting was he realised that he was actually becoming quite obsessive in control of his life, and he wouldn't let things go. And it was actually becoming disabling to his life. And he did struggle with some mental health issues because of his beliefs, because of what he believed about himself, because of what he believed about others. And so he designed a tool, and I'm going to get you to go through this in a second. So he designed a framework to help you to, rather than focus on your goals, which is important, goal setting is really important. But if you're frightened of something, or if you fear something, or there is something getting in your way, he developed the concept of fear setting. And I'm going to allude to the works of Alcoholics Anonymous here. I have a great friend who's battled with alcoholism for many, many years. And he talks about the concept of fear. And AA talk about the concept of fear. And you've got two options. With fear, you can flunk everything and run. And I'm sure you know they don't mean flunk. Okay, so fear, F-E-A-R, flunk everything and run. Or, how AA adopt it, is you can face everything and recover. You can face everything and overcome. And so what Tim Ferriss has done is he's designed a tool that says, what is it that we're afraid of? What is it that's stopping us doing what we might want to be doing? Whether it's stepping up and speaking in, whether it's having presence and impact, whether it's going for a promotion, whether it's changing jobs. And so what he gets you to think about, and I'm going to get you to go through this process, is what is it that we might be frightened of? It's just think about something in your life, something that you might be fearing, something that might be getting in your way, or something you might be thinking about, but you're a bit too frightened to do it. And be honest with yourself. So just think about something that you might fear. Promotion, speaking up, presentation, a whole range of things. Okay? So just 1 minute. Just try and find something. Fear. Yeah, have you all got something? Couple of nods, yeah? So what he says is the key to this is, and this is evidence supported by a leading neuroscientist as well, but what he says is that once you kind of think about fearing something, so a couple of you give me an example. Somebody give me an example. Fear of rejection. Good one. Fear of money. Do you want to elaborate on that? Thank you.
Sorry. Not having that financial security to make the leap.
Okay.
And potentially you could be stuck in a job that, or a sector that doesn't feel that compatible with your values.
So is the fear making the leap, or is the fear not having the money to make the leap?
Not having the money to make the leap.
Okay, so not having the money and rejection. One more. Failure, fear of failure, failure at doing something, yeah? Okay. So what he then says is, I want you to define the problem, okay? So define the fear. So not having enough money. Okay, so if this fear becomes a reality, what's going to happen? So absolutely all the things that will happen. So you said, not having enough money might not change my career. Rejection might not be liked. Yeah, might not be liked. People might not take notice of me. What was yours again? Failure. Might have failed. Okay, so in that fear, I might look silly. People might not take me seriously. So what I want you to do is, in your conversations, is just elaborate and define that fear a bit more. Okay, so I'm frightened of this, and these are all the things that are going to happen. If I do this, these are all the things that might happen. Okay, so just list them. Just talk about them and just list them. So another minute. Okay, so now you must be feeling really awful, thinking about all these things that are really going to go wrong. And what you're doing, what your mind is doing, is you're catastrophizing. You're predicting the future. And all this energy is going into things that haven't even happened yet. But your brain is in overdrive for all of these things that's going to happen. So the next step that he gets you to think about, okay, that's what you fear, and these are all the potential things that go wrong. What can you do to prevent them? So if you were to face your fear, what can you do to prevent those? Okay, so what preparatory work, what can you do? What are some of the things that you can do to prevent those things from happening? Okay? But the next thing I want you to do is, after you've thought about the things that you can do to prevent it, is I want you to think about, okay, so what? The worst thing happens. These things actually happen. What I want you to do now is think about, what can you do to recover it, to repair it? What can you do to put it right? So it's happened. What do you do to put it right? Couple of minutes. What do you do to put it right? So all of you managed to rescue it? You've thought of strategies that you can do to rescue it? Yeah? And one of the things that the neuroscientists show us is that when you actually go through this process of addressing your fears and then thinking about all of the things that you could, if it happens, then all the things that you can do to prevent it. But actually, if it does happen, how are you going to recover it? What you're doing, is the neuroscientists show, is that you're actually preparing yourself, and it helps you to deal with the stress in the moment a lot better. You're psychologically more prepared, and being prepared is forearmed. So the other two questions I want you to think about is, as you go through that process, is the first is, what is the cost to you of inactivity? So what is the cost to you if you don't proceed with your goal and that, and you don't address that fear? And the second is, what does even partial success look like? Okay, so what is the cost of inactivity, of not doing it to you personally, and what does partial success look like? 2 minutes. Fear setting, I think, is a great tool, and I think it goes hand in glove with your goal setting. And how's that process been in terms of going through that? Okay, so what I want us to come back to is the concept of assumptions, and I want us to think about assumptions actually fuel our fears. Okay, because what happens is we try to make sense of things and we fill in the gaps. And I love this quote by Marianne Williamson, which again is linked to about facing our fears. And she says, our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that frightens us most. It's about unleashing our potential. And actually, when we have that fear and we think about all of those things that go wrong, what that does is it keeps us small. It keeps us in those roles that we want to do, and it stops us reaching for those goals that we want to do. But I also want to share with you about the next kind of level of that, which is when you've faced your fears, how do you then step up and have impact? How do you have presence and impact in the moment, whether it's in your conversations or whether it's in your meetings or something that you're conducting or whether it's your presentations? And one of the things that Deborah Tannen talks about is that she's a professor of linguistics and she has studied the art of conversation. And she's also studied the gender differences in conversation, the difference between boys and girls, men and women. And one of the things that she's identified is what we call the concept of directness and indirectness in our language. Okay? And what her literature and her research shows is that men tend to be direct, women tend to be indirect. Does that resonate? So some of the examples are, so men might be indirect saying, I'm not going to do that, or I want this, I need this by then. Women might be, do you think that we could do this a different way? Would you mind? Wouldn't it be good? Do you not think it would be great if you could do this by the end of the week? And think about your relationships with the executives that you're supporting or the leaders that you're supporting. You need to do something, and you only need to do it so that it enables them to do their job. And you're waiting for that opportunity. But we might say, when you get a moment, can you do this for me, please? Is it okay? Can I inconvenience you, please, so that I can help you? The direct approach, which men most often take, is, I can't progress what you've asked me to do until you do this for me. And we're not saying, Deborah Tannen isn't saying about being direct, being aggressive, being abrupt. What she's saying is make your point. This is what Sheryl Sandberg talks into. And actually being indirect often doesn't help you. Now there are moments, of course, when your best friend says, does my bum look big in this? Of course you want to be indirect. Yeah? But when you're actually needing to get things done, you need to actually be able to clearly articulate what it is that you're looking to have done. Does that make sense? So think about your own conversations. Are you being direct or are you being indirect? The other thing that she talks about in terms... Sorry, go on. Deborah Tannen. Yeah, so when you get the slides, you'll see that her name is on there. So Deborah Tannen, Professor of Linguistics. And she actually wrote a great article called Who Gets Heard and Why. And one of the things that she did is she studied the conversations of pilots and co-pilots when they did the black box. And that's when actually she started to realise there was a real difference, because what she found was that even in crisis, and we see this in hospitals, is that because of the hierarchy, you said it earlier, you know what they're not talking about. You can see something that those superior executives are missing. You have a vital piece of information. And if we're being indirect and not bringing it to the table, they will keep going on doing what they're doing. And what she noticed is that actually the concept of indirect and directness sometimes actually costs lives. If the co-pilot is saying, gosh, it's really bad weather out there, what he should be saying is, I think we need to turn off autopilot and we need to get control of this plane. So think about your conversations when you're being indirect or direct. And yes, there's a time and a place for it, and it's not about being aggressive, but it is about getting your point heard. The other thing that she talks about is the concept of the message and a meta-message. Okay, and again, this is where women are really good at this. So they may be delivering a message, but actually there's a subtle message in there. So it might be, shall I book you an appointment for the hairdressers today? What I'm actually saying is, your hair needs cutting. Yeah? Or do you not think that blue outfit might look really better because the yellow one you're wearing really doesn't look good? Yeah? And so what she does is thinks to get you to think about the things that are going in conversations. And it's not just about how you talk and communicate, but it's also about what you're listening for. So thinking about when you're listening, actually, are they being direct or indirect? Because also for you in your role, if somebody's being indirect, you can't help them. So can you be a bit more direct, please? And I'll be direct with you. But sometimes we fear being direct. Does that make sense? So think about that. And she's got some great articles out there. Now, what's a piece of ham pie doing in your presentation this morning? So I'm just going to share 3 things with you before I close with a personal story for you. And this is from some of the work of Lee Warren. And what Lee Warren talks about, his gift, if you get to Google Lee Warren, so he's got some great things on his website, but he talks about how to have presence and impact in an instant. And so one of his, I'm going to give you 3 of his tips about when you're communicating with somebody. And he says the first thing you always need to think about is whenever you're communicating with somebody, and it's important, you need to think about what do you need to get out of this? What do you need to get out of this conversation? What do you need to get out of this meeting? And also, if you're talking to somebody or you're presenting, you're trying to get information across, he says that you need to think about the concept of ham pie. Ham pie, what does ham pie mean? Ham pie simply stands for hearts and minds. Okay, so the ham is how do you communicate so that you actually reach the hearts and minds of people. And the hearts is for those people that are very much more about the emotional connection, and the minds are those people that actually want to know the factual information. But the pie stands for actually use pictures, use images, use metaphors to get your message across. The I is about making it interesting. Is this subject as interesting to them as it is to me? And if it isn't, how can I make it so? And the E is about the emotional connection. How can I make this emotionally connect? If I want to engage somebody in my plight, if I want to get somebody's attention, how do I reach the hearts and minds? How can I use pictures, images, metaphors? How do I make it interesting? And how do I make it emotionally connect? One of the biggest game changers that we had when we had all of the uproar and the outcry about the levels of immigration that were going on, can you remember one of the images that was one of the biggest game changers for the immigration crisis? Yeah, baby on the beach. Yeah, young boy on the beach. Images. Images work. And different things work for different people. So what Lee Warren says is always think about ham pie. Think about hearts and minds, pictures, make it interesting, emotionally connect. That make sense? Okay. The other, okay, what are we doing with a pencil in the room? PEP. P-E-P. When you are communicating, what is the point that you are trying to make? Elaborate that point and close with that point. So an example might be, the point I'd like to make is, there is a storm coming. I'm going to elaborate on that by saying, if you look at the clouds in the sky, the temperature's dropped and the wind has got up. There's a storm coming. You think about that in some of the work that you're doing. If you want to impart information or you want something from somebody, okay, the point you might want to make might be, I'm really concerned that we're going in the wrong direction here with this conversation. For example, Johnny's talking about this, Rona's talking about that, and Simon seems to be disengaged. So I'm really worried that we're going in the wrong direction with this conversation. PEP, P-E-P, point, elaborate, point. Yeah? And then the final one that he talks about is a hook. Okay, how are you going to hook people in? If you want something from somebody or you're needing to communicate with others, what is the hook? And the greatest way to think about the hook is think about the people that you're trying to engage, think about the people that you're trying to communicate with, think about what it is that you want from them or that you want them to do, and think about what's in it for me from their perspective. What's the hook? What's the hook that's going to get them in? And think about it from their perspective, the what's in it for me. Yeah? So when you have overcome your fears and you are in the moment and you are leaning in, there's just a couple of little frameworks there that might help you shape that conversation to help you overcome some of those fears. Are they useful? Yeah? Okay. So finally, I just want to close really with the saying, and this absolutely is proven now, particularly with the evidence that's advancing around neuroscience, which is that our brain, our neurons, we have what's called neuroplasticity. So if you think you can, you can. If you think you can't, you won't. Our brain is full of these little things. These neurons are wonderful, and they're plastic. And one of the things that we can do is we can actually rewire our brain through changing the way that we think. If we change the way that we think, we ultimately change our behaviours. If we change our behaviours, we overcome our fears. We become present, we have impact, we can lean in, we get noticed, we get what we want. Doesn't mean to say that we won't fall down again, but we learn from that and we get ourselves back up. But your brain is full of these neurons and they have what's called this plasticity. So you can change, and the evidence is supporting that. So the more that you think about something, the more that you try it, the more positive thinking, the more framing, the more fear setting that you do, the more you can overcome those fears and achieve what you want to achieve. So I'm going to close with a story. This is Sharon Jones. This is my sister. And my sister has been in her career, well, I'm 47, she's nearly 50, and she joined a YTS apprentice as an executive assistant in one of the largest councils in England. And she constantly leaned in, and wouldn't say her confidence was always great, but she often got into a role, did it, excelled at it. She then kind of rose up through the ranks, became the executive office manager. So she managed the other executive assistants that looked after the executives of the executive board in the large county council. She then became the executive manager, so she managed the whole of the executive suite. And within that role, she also then she became the executive lead for all major events, royal visits and elections. Also, adding to that, she became a registrar, so she could marry people. And she loved that. She really loved that. But with her diligence and with her constant leaning in and that self-belief, she actually has now become a chief executive in her own right of a community council, because she was the expert that sat behind those executive directors all of the time. She knew everything about what they were doing. She developed her expertise and she became her own chief executive. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for listening, and I hope you've got something from it.